From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. Despite a lot of rain this spring, Northeast Regional Extension Office Crops and Soil Specialist Stu Duncan says that field conditions finally appear to be improving somewhat within the region. He'll provide an update on what he's been seeing in the fields. Ryan Armbrust, the Health and Conservation Forester with the Kansas Forest Service, discusses sudden oak death and how best to respond to it being found in certain rhododendron container plants in Kansas, the steps the people need to take to safely dispose of it. And Eric visits with K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd about protecting ourselves from ticks, mosquitoes, and chiggers. It's all just ahead on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
This is Agriculture Today. Excessive rainfall this spring has created a variety of problems and concerns for farmers and ranchers across Kansas. However, conditions may be improving somewhat in northeast and north central Kansas, according to the Northeast Regional Extension Office Crops and Soil Specialist Stu Duncan. He joins us for an update on the conditions that he's been seeing throughout that part of the state. Stu, you are spending a lot of time in the fields around northeast Kansas. What are some of the things that you're starting to see?
Well, Jeff, that's a really good question, and it just depends on which part of the area that you're in. We're seeing a lot of corn getting planted this last week, and guys got started on soybeans. Just a mad rush to get things done. Wheat is starting to fill in the northern parts of central Kansas and is moving right along down in the south central part, at least north of Wichita. Just a great time of year for a lot of variety out where we're at. The biggest thing, of course, we've seen is the delay in many of these operations and farm operations just because of the continued wet weather and rainfall we've had. But there was an awful lot of farm work got done this week, and since the last time I was in here with Eric anyway. Our wheat tours, we were in some fields that probably 2 or 3 weeks ago were really pretty shaky. Some of the later planted wheat last fall, of our 2 crops, we had one that got planted by October 1st and one that didn't get planted until November because of all the rainfall. And the November stuff was looking pretty sketchy all winter and all spring. And actually, right now, it's some of the best. It really, really looks good in the plots south of Abilene where we were at, and up in north central at Belleville and Clifton Clyde area, and down at Idana out west of Clay Center. They were all late planted, and they really looked pretty doggone good. Just getting flowered, though, and that always makes us shaky. They should have been flowering back in the second week of May or so, and they just have been delayed. If our weather will hold like our climatologists are predicting, anyway, the modeling says it's going to be cooler and damper, but very good for wheat filling. So it looks good there. We're starting to see the diseases crop up now. So don't know what's going to happen for sure. If it gets hot, we could catch those varieties late, or those plots, the guys that were planted late. It could cut some test weight off, maybe shrivel some kernels, but all in all, a lot better looking than it was a month ago.
What are some of those primary disease concerns right now?
Well, we really saw a good dose of leaf rust. Stripe rust was taken off again, and then we're starting to see a lot of Fusarium head blight or scab is showing up, and that one I think we're going to see more of that as time goes on. It infects, and you don't really see much of it for about 2 to 3 weeks. But it's rearing its ugly little head. We'll see what happens. Corn has really been developing well through the valley. I'm shifting gears on you a little bit here, but it looks. There's a lot of yellow corn out there. I have grown accustomed to, once I got back up into northeast Kansas, that corn could look pretty rough until about the third week of June, at least from Manhattan over to Topeka in the River Valley, just because it hasn't caught up with the nitrogen yet. It's about the third week of June. I always kind of kid about it. It's somewhere between the 18th and the 20th. It all turns green, gets the same height, and then you can't tell the rest of summer how bad it looked. We'll see how that works out this year. But a lot of low areas are looking pretty tough. There was some replanting that has gone on with the corn, and even some late planting. Back to those low areas, we have wheat now that's turning white, that's drowned out. But now I'm bouncing around. But the corn is continuing to grow well, and corn will. It likes heat, but it likes the cooler, damper. It'll grow a lot better than soybeans and sorghum are particularly slow moving along when it's cool and damper. Corn will go ahead and do its thing.
What are we seeing then in terms of soybeans?
We're still behind planting-wise. The crop report I saw from last week, I don't know if I've seen this one yet, was we were way behind, but we weren't as way behind as they are in the 3I states, and that's where the center of the soybean producing world seems to revolve around, or it seems to in the media. But our soybean plantings are way behind as well. There were a lot of them got in here this last week. Hopefully, the rains we did catch, hopefully they're not going to be really hard driving rains, as some of these are going into tilled ground. I've seen more tilled ground again this year than I thought I might. We had a little trouble getting our fall or spring pre-emerge or burn downs on this year, and we just aren't. We've got several fields where stuff has gotten away, and it's going to be hard to kill it chemically. And some guys have pulled out their tillage implements, and it's been hard to get in with them too, because I saw a planter yesterday. He was planting, but he wasn't planting when I saw it. The front end of the tractor was almost off the ground, and the back end was sunk down in a hole, and he just hit a wet spot, and it was bad. So
they're really taking some risks just trying to get different crops in, right?
Well, it's just been tough, yes. And, we still have time for beans and sorghum and even corn in certain parts in the parts of the state. If you look at the models that are out there from the data we've had in the past and the predictions, you may have to shorten up a hybrid, but if you've already got your herbicide and your fertilizer or your anhydrous down, which many farmers did, they're almost stuck with corn or sorghum, and I think the insurance is gone on the corn, but it will thrive better in some of these conditions we've got. So they really need to think that through very well before they make that decision and be able to have a place to go with it.
How small do you think that window is right now, though? For
Your guess is as good as mine. It's just a matter of, if they'll visit with the county agent, the e-update from, I think it was late last week, had a delayed corn harvest planting article in there, and they mentioned a couple of websites. One of them was from Purdue, but Kansas Mesonet has a prediction model that we've used they put together from heat units that we've gathered in the past and what corn yields have done into it. They will, if they plant a longer season hybrid, it's still going to shorten up the time it takes to get to black layer, or they can go to a shorter season hybrid. It's still just a matter of, will it make it before frost? You can get a pretty good idea of that from going through that. It's a very simple spreadsheet to run. I was even able to do it, so I know anybody else could too. And I was pretty impressed with playing with it, but they need to take the time to do it. And that's in I believe it was our May 24th or the 23rd, I believe it was the e-update those are in there. And it's a short exercise and just a matter of taking time to do it. And they can run through that with their county agent, or if they've got some people have a subscription to that e-update themselves, they can just run right through it and see what help them make a decision.
Worth running the numbers.
Yeah, it certainly is. It certainly is.
You were also saying that one of the best brome crops that you've seen in recent years?
Yes, I think I wanted to look at some of the positive things we've had going, and I've really been impressed with at least where the folks if they got their brome grass fertilized last fall or this spring. I've seen a really good response to our fertilizer. It's we've had some rough years on the brome grass recently, and we are short of hay. 2 years ago, we were shipping all of our hay someplace else to help folks out that it ran out, and we ran out last summer with that mess we had until when it finally started raining in September and our pastures were already done. We had some folks, I know Leroy Russell, our agent over in Shawnee County, told me some of his growers planted rye last fall and were actually able to graze it all winter long and through the spring and got through without having to use very much hay, if any. But that was a good deal in that respect. But our brome is looking really, really good right now, and we're right in the season. Of course, it's just starting to bloom. You'd like to cut it down, but you don't want to get wet 10 times either. So we're going to start losing quality of forage, but it's still going to be really good quality if we can get it down and wrapped up before harvest. I know some alfalfa got watered down pretty good in the last 2 days, and a lot of it got chopped too. But brome, that kind of excites me to see it looking as good as it does this spring, because it really looked bad. We just haven't had good weather for producing brome the last 3 years.
Is forage going to be an issue this year?
For our cattlemen, yeah, I think it could be. Our native range is taking off really slowly. As I see, a lot of it was – I drive by some pastures on the way in to Manhattan in the morning, and there's a couple of places where folks had their calving pastures, and I've never seen them stomped quite as bad as they are this year, and it's just because it's been so doggone wet, and they didn't want to move them anyplace else to do the same thing. But the native range is taking off pretty slowly. But it's we've had some warm days here. It starts to take off, and it's kind of we got the hiccups, start and stop. But
so this is an atypical Kansas scenario, but we are starting to see some more positives to go along with some of the bad stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't know if uncertainty is atypical for Kansas, but at least our springs. But no, this has been challenging. And coming on two challenging years in a row, it's kind of tough.
That's Northeast Regional Extension Office Crops and Soil Specialist Stu Duncan with an overview of what he's been seeing in some of the fields in that region of the state. Agriculture Today is back in a moment. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. The Kansas Department of Agriculture announced late last week that the pathogen that causes sudden oak death was found in rhododendron container plants. This is the first time that sudden oak death has been reported in the state. Ryan Armbrust, the Health and Conservation Forester with the Kansas Forest Service, joins us now to explain how this pathogen can affect oaks and what can be done to help prevent it from spreading. Ryan, this is something that just kind of blew up last week, and I'm sure that you're getting a lot of phone calls, making a lot of appearances, trying to get the word out. And really, that's where we're starting, is by getting the word out about this pathogen.
Yeah, absolutely. We usually don't see forest health concerns in the news this much, but we definitely are concerned with something that has a shocking name as sudden oak death, that this could have an impact. We don't often think of Kansas as being a forested state, but of course we have about 4.5 million acres of forest in the state, and we have a number of oaks that are important parts of our community and our rural forests. And when we get something that's never been in the state, like Phytophthora ramorum, also known as sudden oak death, it certainly makes us concerned.
Walk us through it. How did this all come about?
Well, we received word from our friends and partners at Kansas Department of Agriculture that at some point this spring, a number of Walmarts and one Home Depot in the state of Kansas received a shipment of rhododendrons that ultimately were sourced from the West Coast, passed through a nursery in Oklahoma, but they came into the state and were distributed. As it turns out, they had Phytophthora ramorum present in those plants.
And this will do what? What is actually being caused by this pathogen?
So Phytophthora causes various levels of blight on the many different plants it infests. We know that it can infest at least 60 different species and types of plants. The most significant is on red oak trees or trees in the red oak group in California. It can cause rapid death, cankers, and limb dieback. On a lot of other horticultural and nursery plants, it just causes what would look like a blight, some leaves turning brown and dying, some tip dieback, but ultimately it doesn't cause large and significant mortality on nursery plants. Unfortunately, it does cause oak mortality, and we don't know yet exactly what that would look like in the central part of the country here because it's never been here before.
So where do we go from here then? If it's never been here before, what are we telling people to do? I assume the first thing is to make sure if you bought one of these rhododendrons to bag it and dispose of it.
Absolutely. If you bought a rhododendron this spring, anytime April on from a Walmart in Kansas or from the Home Depot in Pittsburgh, you should absolutely dig that up, including the root ball, put it in a trash bag, put that in another trash bag and dispose of it either by burying it or taking it to an approved landfill. And you should make sure you clean your tools and sanitize your tools and any boots or anything else that came into contact with the soil at that point. The good news is right now it's only been detected on those rhododendrons. We don't know of any cases where it's escaped out into the woodlands, and that's very good, and that's a point I really want to emphasize. Sudden oak death sounds really bad, but it's not in our oak forests yet, and we want to take as many steps as we can to ensure that it doesn't get into those forests because, well, we're not sure that it would cause widespread mortality. Our oak forests are very important, and we don't want to lose them.
And this would be primarily in the eastern part of the state?
Due to the life cycle of Phytophthora and kind of the environment it requires, it has to have red oak forests. It really persists in areas that are humid and wet. That's really the eastern part of the state. So we're not really concerned with what may happen should this be introduced, in Dodge City, for instance, because we just don't have the susceptible red oak type forest there. But in the eastern part of the state, we absolutely have a lot of red oak, Shumard oak, pin oak, really anything in that red oak family. That's the area that we're concerned about because we have the oaks there and we have the wet weather that would really cause Phytophthora to perhaps thrive should it get established.
This is not just a Kansas issue. This is an issue that is spreading to several other states?
Yeah, unfortunately, this same large shipment, it looks like got distributed to, at last count, 18 different states. So in some ways, we're fortunate we're not the only ones in this boat, but it certainly is a risk for the central hardwood forest type all across the middle part of the country where there are a lot of red oaks. And hopefully this can get contained by a lot of the State Department of Agriculture and universities working in those 18 states.
One of the things you told me before we started recording was the fact that the good news is there's no disease triangle. Explain that.
Yeah, I often use this example where we're familiar with the fire triangle where you have to have fuel and a source of ignition and oxygen in order to have fire. And fire extinguishers work by eliminating, a source of oxygen for that. So the disease triangle is similar where we have to have a pathogen, we have to have a suitable environment, and we have to have a susceptible host. Well, we know now that we have the pathogen. Phytophthora, we know, showed up on these rhododendrons. We perhaps have a susceptible host in our red oaks. We're not certain yet. And we may have a favorable environment in the eastern part of the state where we have that wet weather. But the good news is, to this point, we don't think that pathogen has been put in contact with those susceptible hosts. And that's really what we're trying to prevent here. We're trying to get those rhododendrons out of the environment before they really have the opportunity to spread the Phytophthora potentially to our red oaks. Because
this is so much in the news right now, is there the concern that anytime somebody sees something out of the ordinary, they're going to jump to SOD as being the cause?
Absolutely, and we saw this repeated a little bit when we first had emerald ash borer in the state, that any time an ash tree looked a little bit off, the suspicion really was that it was emerald ash borer. There are a number of things that can cause our red oaks to look a little bit off, to have a few leaves die back, to have a little bit of limb die back, or develop a canker even, and those are certainly concerns. We want our red oaks to be vigorous and healthy, but anything that looks out of the ordinary in a red oak is not necessarily going to be sudden oak death. We would encourage people to keep a close eye on their oaks and work with their county extension agents and their tree care professionals to monitor their oaks for this, but we don't want everybody who sees a red oak that looks wrong in the landscape to send it into the lab for samples or to assume it's sudden oak death and certainly not cut it down because they think their tree is going to die. We're still kind of learning this as we go because thankfully we haven't had sudden oak death in this state yet. But the good news is that sudden oak death has been pretty well explored and understood in California for a while. So should it come to be established, we've got some pretty good management guidelines I think we could begin to engage in. but it's still very early to really be taking any of those steps yet. Right now, we're very much just encouraging people to remove those rhododendrons and to keep an eye on their landscape and make sure that we don't get that pathogen out there. We don't have anything to manage yet on our red oaks because sudden oak death is not established in our forests.
It is only confined to those ones in Walmart and the one in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, it is. So if you had a rhododendron that you planted 3 or 4 years ago and now it's starting to look bad, it's unlikely that this is sudden oak death. If you have a lilac that you planted this spring, again, this was only on rhododendrons, so we're probably not as concerned about it. So anything you planted this spring doesn't necessarily need to be removed and burned out of the landscape. We're really just focusing on those rhododendrons from the Walmarts and the Home Depot in Pittsburgh. At this point, that is the only source that we know of that's out there that is infested.
So really at this point, we're just trying to make people aware that this is existing and really to get people who did buy one of those to take care of it.
Absolutely. That's our priority at this time, to identify all those plants that are out there that we know to be infested and remove those. And there'll be quite a bit of follow-up scouting and work done afterwards to make sure that those plants didn't actually spread it to anything else in the landscape.
And as you mentioned, if you do have questions, they can contact the Forest Service or just go through the extension agents.
I would encourage people to feel free to contact their extension agents, and if they have any further questions, they can contact the Kansas State Plant Pathology Department. They can contact me at the Kansas Forest Service. We're all here to really help people understand their best management tactics and best steps going forward to really preserve all the great plants in our landscapes and all the valuable red oaks in our forests.
You're really all working on this together because it's something that I said at the beginning just kind of blew up on Friday.
Absolutely. We're very fortunate in the state of Kansas. We've got a really good relationship between a number of agencies and universities where we were able to come together and really have a cooperative response to this quickly. We really set that groundwork, I think, through some other things we've worked through in the past, including emerald ash borer. And all of our objectives at the end is to really preserve the resource and have that best service to our citizens in Kansas so we can all have these good resources going forward.
Maybe while we have just a couple more minutes, let me ask you about some things that landowners should be thinking about over the next couple of months because we had that unusually wet spring. We don't know what summer is going to bring on, but it doesn't often take long for a tree that's used to having so much water to suffer once it does start to heat up.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we all know that rain is good for the plants and trees, but when we have long-term saturated soils or even flooding and standing water for significant amounts of time, you can have some root dieback, which then decreases that tree's ability to take up water later in the year. So somewhat unexpectedly, when you have too much water in the spring, it actually can lead to more drought conditions later in the summer because you have root dieback. So for any areas that are really dealing with some flooding this spring on their trees, you will want to consider later in the year providing some supplemental irrigation and supplemental water for those trees. I can't tell you what day it'll stop raining in Kansas, but in the last few years it seems like we've had a lot of really wet springs, and then the summer becomes pretty dry and we go a long period between rains. And that'll negatively impact our trees if we're not providing some supplemental water for them.
And really the water has to sit there for quite a while to cause a lot of damage, right?
In the most case, you have to have long-term water sitting there for you to really have a lot of damage. Some trees are very susceptible to short-term flooding. Eastern red cedar and most conifers, even just a few days to a week or so of standing water can start to really stress that tree and cause some mortality. On the far end of the spectrum, things like cottonwoods and willows can really tolerate months even of flooding, especially if that water is moving. If it's still water that's become stagnant, it's much less of a period of time when those trees can still recover from that. But most of our upland trees in Kansas, including a lot of oaks, really tend to tolerate less flooding, whereas some of the lowland species like walnuts or pecans can have a little bit longer flooding and still bounce back and be healthy. But if your trees start to dry out a little bit late summer, the best thing we can do for our trees often is just to provide water when it's dry. That's going to go the furthest in terms of keeping those trees vigorous and healthy.
That's Ryan Armbrust, the Health and Conservation Forester with the Kansas Forest Service. Again, if you have questions regarding sudden oak death, contact your local county or district extension office. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. In today's agricultural news, a presidential executive order, along with new proposed USDA regulations, will help speed up the approval and availability of new biotech crops. Gary Crawford reports.
Farmers are not only promoting our prosperity, you are protecting our security as a nation.
President Trump at an ethanol plant in Iowa Tuesday talking about year-round sales of E15, also trade deals, disaster help for farmers, and other subjects. Also, the president signed
an executive order to speed up reviews of biotechnology so that farmers can get access to critical scientific advances faster and reap the full benefit for many years into the future.
In conjunction with that order, the USDA last week issued proposed new regulations for how new biotech crops would be evaluated for safety and approved for use. Regulations which Undersecretary of Agriculture Greg Ibaugh said in conjunction with the executive order would strike a balance between
efficiency as well as an appropriate regulatory oversight mechanism.
He said under current rules, it can take 5 to 7 years for a new biotech crop to be approved. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Members of the agriculture sector are encouraged and anxious about getting the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement approved and operational as soon as possible. Rod Bain has more.
Ask most farm and commodity organizations which potential ag trade deal is perhaps the most significant for their industry at this moment, and their top priority is not a trade agreement with Japan, the European Union, or even China.
We are really encouraged by the agreement that is in place under USMCA. We think it's a really strong agreement, and we're really hopeful that the agreement will be ratified and we'll have another strong trade agreement in place with two of our top trading partners.
Kim Atkins of the U.S. Grains Council echoing the thoughts of several about the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. One reason for the emphasis by farm and commodity groups on USMCA is its present status compared to other ongoing trade negotiations. This is Chris Galen of the National Milk Producers Federation.
Right now, although it's negotiated, and when it's passed, it looks like it'll be a good deal for U.S. dairy farmers. We need to see that get passed by Congress,
as well as lawmaking bodies of the other USMCA member nations. What was considered a major barrier to getting USMCA approved, tariffs on steel and aluminum, known as Section 232 tariffs, were lifted recently by the Trump administration. In turn, both Mexico and Canada lifted their retaliatory tariffs on U.S. ag exports, such as pork, dairy, frozen potatoes, and yogurt. And while not yet ratified by member nations, as Diane Curley of the U.S. Apple Association points out,
the USMCA can work the way it's meant to, which is without tariffs.
Virtually zero tariffs for ag goods among the three USMCA partners, much like the existing North American Free Trade Agreement. But building upon NAFTA, USMCA offers greater opportunities for our ag products in the Mexican and Canadian markets, including a first-ever chapter in a trade deal addressing biosciences, as well as an update on sanitary and phytosanitary provisions, which Kent Bacchus of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association approves.
It does codify some of the sanitary and phytosanitary standards that have sometimes been used to restrict trade. Under this new agreement, we're not going to see that problem anymore.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Kansas State University researchers have identified a gene that will further boost efforts to develop new wheat varieties capable of resisting Fusarium head blight, FHB, a fungal disease that threatens production worldwide. The 20-year study, which is being published in Nature Genetics, found that a gene known as TAHRC plays a key role in providing resistance to FHB, also known as scab disease. The research team was able to modify the production of select proteins in wheat by shutting off the gene, thus increasing the plant's ability to resist FHB. They found that this gene is a susceptible gene in most wheat lines, and that deleting part of the gene caused it to lose its function and make the plant more resistant. The finding is significant in scientists' quest to find resistance to FHB, which can cause crippling losses to wheat production. In fact, from 1993 to 2001, the disease caused $7.6 billion in losses in U.S. wheat fields, and more recently, in 2015, the Kansas wheat crop was hit by an estimated 3.4% yield loss due to FHB. Minnesota farmers have been hit especially hard. Since the 1990s, officials estimate $2.7 billion in losses for that state's wheat and barley industries due to FHB, causing many growers to file bankruptcy. The possibility of FHB increases in areas where corn is grown in a no-till situation, where debris is left on the surface of the soil. In addition to causing substantial production losses, FHB can cause a mycotoxin that can cause sickness in humans and animals when healthy wheat mixes with infected seeds. The K-State scientists think that the TAHRC gene, previously called FHB1, will provide the best resistance to FHB. It was initially found in a Chinese line and was introduced to U.S. wheat breeding programs more than 30 years ago. The research was conducted through a collaboration between Kansas State University and USDA's Agricultural Research Service. Well, progress is being made by the Natural Resources Conservation Service in developing rules for programs the agency will administer under the 2018 Farm Bill. Rod Bain has more.
As with other USDA agencies, Natural Resources Conservation Service leadership and staff have been busy going through the rules and regulations associated with 2018 Farm Bill programs.
Throughout January up until now, they have been working diligently to go through the entire process.
NRCS Chief Matthew Lohr, speaking recently to lawmakers, said in terms of a target date for completion,
I think we're definitely on track. Our goal is to have these rules, the interim rules, formulated by the first quarter of the new fiscal year. So I think we're on track to make that happen.
And the chief adds, even with work on NRCS Farm Bill programs for 2020,
the current Farm Bill programs, our farmers haven't had any gap in service because based on the extension from the 2014 Farm Bill, they have been able to continue as normal this year. So the rules that we're writing will take effect for 2020. So 2019, everything runs as before.
Changes via the 2018 Farm Bill include a new component to the Conservation Stewardship Program and increased funding for the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And that's a look at today's agricultural news. This reminder to listen to the podcast version of Agriculture Today, visit agtoday.net, or using a podcast app on your mobile device, type in these search keywords, Agriculture, Today, Kansas, and you'll find this program. Tap the subscribe button, and brand new episodes of Agriculture Today will automatically arrive on your device. agtoday.net. Agriculture Today is back after the break. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. The abundant moisture this spring has created a thriving environment for a host of insect pests. In this week's horticulture segment, Eric Atkinson visits with K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd about mosquitoes, chiggers, ants, slugs, and ticks.
Again, Raymond, you are on the receiving end of calls and inquiries about this heavy tick population out there, seemingly more so than normal. Is that the case?
Well, I think it's mostly due, Eric, to the all the rain we've gotten in the waterlogged conditions and all the grass that's growing up. I mean, when we get these warm temperatures, you can almost see the grass grow. And these areas are where ticks are going to be waiting to latch on to somebody. So if you're out there walking in these unmanaged areas, be sure to wear a repellent and also tuck your pants into your socks, white socks, and check yourself when you come back because the ticks will latch on to you and you don't want them to get engorged and start sucking blood because then you have the issue of removing them. So really take as much preventative measures as you can to avoid getting ticks.
Well, Raymond, let's talk about mosquitoes. To no one's surprise, they are abundant out there because of the overly wet conditions, right?
Exactly. Just like ticks, I mean, most of your floodwater mosquitoes are going to be out there. Again, avoid being out there between dawn and dusk, which is when they're most active. And if you're going to go outside, put on a repellent such as DEET and cover your body, and then, come in and take a shower. But the other aspect is with all the rain, there's probably a lot of habitats out there, wheelbarrows, tires, anything that holds water and is stagnant is a great breeding ground for mosquitoes.
So rid of those areas if you can at all possible.
Remove any stagnant water conditions, bird baths, clean them and stuff, dog dishes, cat dishes, get rid of old tires. Those are all areas where mosquitoes can breed.
As you know, folks who spend time, say, on the back deck or elsewhere in the yard for extended periods, ask the question, can one treat an area of the yard and do away with mosquitoes, or at least suppress them?
Well, it's a good question, Eric, because a lot of municipalities go to what we call these blanket treatments. They're probably using mostly a pyrethroid insecticide. And I think the information's out there, mostly data showing that you're probably doing more negative effects by killing pollinators and beneficials than you are mosquitoes. I think, again, what I'll call it Ray Cloyd's three-pronged approach to mosquitoes is removing breeding sites. We've already mentioned those. Wearing repellents, DEET is one of them. There are others out there. And then also, if you have fish ponds or other areas that, are going to be stagnant, you can throw in the mosquito dunks or the mosquito flakes. And what these are, this is another bacteria, very similar to one we use for caterpillars, but only kills mosquito larvae. So you can put it in dog dishes and cat dishes and fish ponds, and it won't impact them at all. And it only kills the larva mosquitoes. So that's what we call the three-pronged approach for dealing with mosquitoes.
Take that into account. We'll probably be battling those for the better part of the summer.
If we get a lot more rain, we will, yes.
Yeah. And chiggers are getting after it as well, and the painful bite that they put on a person. What about dealing with those and in some fashion controlling chiggers?
Well, it's difficult to say controlled chiggers, but it would be the same for like mosquitoes and ticks as wearing some type of repellent. Mm-hmm. I know the old adage on farmers would put sulfur in their socks. Sulfur is an old miticide, and it would keep the chiggers out. But again, when you're in these wooded areas that are not managed, when you come back, be sure to take a shower to wash anything off. And, again, especially for ticks, have somebody look you over because the nymphs and the larvae are extremely small and they're very hard to detect with the naked eye. Mm-hmm. So, again, I think the remedies or the strategies for dealing with chiggers, ticks, and mosquitoes is going to be pretty much synonymous the same, yeah.
All right. So protect yourself with the appropriate personal treatment.
And mow areas regularly. That'll also, not eliminate, but alleviate problems with chiggers and also ticks.
Want to quickly revisit something we've visited about before because of the abundant moisture. Ants entering the homes and still getting some inquiries about that too?
Yes, because of the soggy soils, most ants are going to reside in the soil. They don't like that, so they start coming in the homes where it's dry. And again, I think I mentioned this in previous shows, is you want to use like a boric acid bait. You don't want to be spraying all those workers out there, but, put baits in your house and they'll grab it, take it back to the colony, and feed it to the other individuals. So, this is just always an issue. When we get heavy rains, we'll get, ants start coming in the home to escape the soggy soil conditions.
But again, by name, a boric acid bait, you say?
Boric acid is the active ingredient. One of the baits, I don't promote products, but taro is one of the products, but there's others out there that you can. There are also other baits out there that contain different active ingredients. You don't want a material that just kills the workers because then you get no transfer of the food back to the main colony.
All right. So get after those as well, and they can be harnessed fairly handily with a proper bait product. Now, slugs in wet spots around the yard. They are seemingly harmless, but is that so?
Not really, Eric. I mean, slugs, of course, and snails, the relatives, they love moist conditions, and the wet weather we've had is just conducive. We've had inquiries of feeding on one of their favorite hosts, and that's hosta. Hosta, great big leaf they hide under there. Some of the recommendations, I know you can't control the rain, but there are some baits out there. One with metaldehyde. The problem with metaldehyde is a nerve toxin and is very harmful to dogs and cats. But the one that's widely sold that I see is called Sluggo, and it's iron phosphate. And iron phosphate is not toxic to dogs and cats, and it seems to be it does work very effectively. But you have to be very diligent putting the bait out there on a regular basis, because after a hard rain, it just basically washes it away.
Now, the bait is not a product you'd apply to, say, a hosta directly, but in the area around a target plant? What?
You'd put it around the plants, Eric. You wouldn't put them directly on the plant, yeah. And then there's that issue about diatomaceous earth. And diatomaceous earth does not work well when it gets wet. I have experience with that product for 5-10 years. It's mostly used under dry conditions, but as something for snails and slugs, it's less effective than people really think it is.
And hostas are one possible feeding area for these slugs. Do they go after any other ornamentals?
Oh, they go after many different types of perennials and annual bedding plants, yeah. Yeah, they have a very wide host range, Eric, yeah.
So if something's feeding on your ornamentals, you're not sure what it is, you might check it out. You're looking for slugs, and they're apparent. Raymond, visually?
Well, they are nocturnal, which means they feed at night. But one of the distinguishing characteristics is they leave a silvery, reflective trail that really, in the sunlight, you'll see it. But they only feed at night, so you won't hardly see them in the daytime. So you have to go out there with a flashlight and find them. And, of course, I know there's the old adage about the beer in the pans and putting it out there. That really depends on the brand of beer you use and, and how prevalent the slugs are. So I would probably go with some of the alternative ones before I would go to that. Yeah.
Very well. Raymond, thanks so much. We'll welcome you back soon.
I'll look forward to your next visit, Eric.
That's Raymond Cloyd, horticultural entomologist, K-State Research and Extension, and this week's K-State Horticulture segment for you.
Thanks, Eric. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.